He Fell in Love with His Wife by 𝙿𝚊𝚗𝚗. Chapter 32. Jane Plays Mouse to the Lion. It can well be understood that Jane had no disposition to return to Mrs. Holcroft and the humdrum duties of the house. There opened before her an exciting line of action which fully accorded with her nature, and she entered upon it at once. Her first impulse was to follow the man of whom she had learned so much. Not only was she spurred to this course by her curiosity, but also by her instinctive loyalty to Holcroft, and, it must be admitted, by her own interests. Poor little Jane had been nurtured in a hard school, and had by this time learned the necessity of looking out for herself. This truth, united with her shrewd, matter-of-fact mind, led her to do the most sensible thing under the circumstances. "I know a lot now that he'll be glad to know, and if I tell him everything he'll keep me always. The first thing I want to do is know what's become of that threatening scamp." And she followed Ferguson with the stealth of an Indian. Ferguson was not only a scamp, but like most his class, a coward. He had been bitterly disappointed in his interview with 𝙿𝚘𝚗𝚗. As far as his selfish nature permitted, he had a genuine affection for her, and he had thought of little else besides her evident fondness for him. He was so devoid of moral principle that he could not comprehend a nature like hers, and had scarcely believed it possible that she would repulse him so inflexibly. She had always been so gentle, yielding, and subservient to his wishes, that he had thought that, having been assured of his wife's death, a little persuasion, and perhaps a few threats, would induce her to follow him, for he could not imagine her becoming attached to such a man as Holcroft had been described to be. Her uncompromising principle had entered but slightly into his calculations, and so, under the spur of anger and selfishness, he had easily entered upon a game of bluff. He knew well enough that he had no claim upon 𝙿𝚘𝚗𝚗, yet it was in harmony with his false heart to try to make her think so. He had no serious intention of harming Holcroft. He would be afraid to attempt this. But if he could so work on 𝙿𝚘𝚗𝚗's fears as to induce her to leave her husband, he believed that the future would be full of possibilities. At any rate, he would find his revenge in making 𝙿𝚘𝚗𝚗 and Holcroft all the trouble possible. Even in the excitement of the interview, however, he realized that he was playing a dangerous game, and when Jane answered so readily to 𝙿𝚘𝚗's call, he was not a little disturbed. Satisfied that he had accomplished all that he could hope for at present, his purpose now was to get back to town unobserved and await developments. He therefore walked rapidly down the lane and pursued the road for a short distance until he came to an old, disused lane leading up the hillside to a grove where he had concealed a horse and buggy. Unless there should be a necessity, it was his intention to remain in his hiding-place until after nightfall. Jane had merely to skirt the bushy hillside higher up in order to keep Ferguson in view and discover the spot in which he was lurking. Instead of returning to the house, she kept right on, maintaining a sharp eye on the road beneath to make sure that Holcroft did not pass unobserved. By an extended detour, she reached the highway and continued toward the town, in the hope of meeting the farmer. At last she saw him driving rapidly homeward. He was consumed with anxiety to be at least near to 𝙿𝚘𝚗𝚗𝚗, even if, as he believed, he was no longer welcome in her presence. When Jane stepped out into the road, he pulled up his horses and stared at her. She, almost bursting with her great secrets, put her finger on her lips and nodded portentously. "Well, what is it?" he asked, his heart beating quickly. "I have a lot to tell you, but don't want no one to see us." "About my wife?" The girl nodded. "Good God, speak then! Is she sick?" And he sprung out and caught her arm with a grasp that hurt her. "Please, sir, I'm doing all I can for you, and you hurt me." Holcroft saw that the tears were coming to her eyes, and he released his hold as he said, "Forgive me, Jane, I didn't mean to. But for mercy's sake, tell your story." "It's a long one." "Well, give me the gist of it in a word." "I guess she's going to run away." Holcroft groaned and almost staggered to his horses' heads, then led them to the roadside and tied them to a tree. Sitting down as if too weak to stand, he buried his face in his hands. He could not bear to have Jane see his distress. "Tell your story," he said hoarsely. "Quick, for I may have to act quickly." "Guess you will. Do you know she was married?" "Certainly. To me?" "No, to another man. married by a minister. He's been there with her." She little foresaw the effect of her words, for the farmer bounded to his feet with an oath and sprang to his horses. "Stop!" cried Jane, tugging at his arm. "If you go rushing home now, you'll show you've got no more sense than mother. You'll spoil everything. She ain't gonna run away with him. She said she wouldn't, though he coaxed and threatened to kill you if she didn't. If I was a man, I wouldn't act like a mad bull. I'd find out how to get ahead of the other man." "Well," said Holcroft in a voice that frightened the child, "she said she wouldn't run away with this scoundrel. Of course not. But you say she's going to leave. She'll meet him somewhere. Good God! But how should you understand? Come, let me get home. I understand a sight more than you do, and you go on so that I can't tell you anything. If you showed sense, you'd be glad I was looking out for you, and I could tell you everything. What's the good of going ramping home, when if you'd only listen, you could get even with that scoundrel, as you call him, and make it all right?" And Jane began to cry. "Oh, thunder!" exclaimed the chaffing man. "Tell me your story at once, or you'll drive me mad. You don't half know what you're talking about, or how much your words mean. How should you? The thing to do is to get home as soon as possible." "You ain't no reason to be so mad and glum all the while," cried Jane, smarting under a sense of injustice. "Here I'm a-trying to do for you, and you'll be sorry enough when you don't stop and listen. And she's been a-trying to do for you all along, and she's been standing up for you this afternoon, and is going to run away to save your life." "Run away to save my life? Are you crazy?" "No, but you be," cried the girl, excited and exasperated beyond restraint. "If she is your wife, I'd stand up for her and take care of her, since she stands up for you so. Instead of that, you go around glum as a thundercloud, and now want to go raging home to her. Don't know whether she's your wife or not, but I do know she said she loved you and would die for you, and she wouldn't do a thing that man asked but go away to save your life." Holcroft looked at the girl as if dazed. "Said she loved me," he repeated slowly. "Of course! You know that all along. Anybody could see it, and you don't treat her much better than you did mother." Then, with an impatient gesture, she asked, "Will you sit down and listen?" "No, I won't!" he cried, springing toward his horses. "I'll find out if your words are true." "Oh, yes," said Jane contemptuously. "Run right to her and find out something as plain as the nose on her face, and run right by the man who was threatening her, and you too." Wheeling around, he asked, "Where is he?" "I know, but I won't say another word till you stop going on. If I was a man, I'd find out what to do before I did anything." Jane had little comprehension of the tempest she had raised in Holcroft's soul or its causes, and was in no mood to make allowances for him. By this time the first gust of his passion was passing, and reason resuming its sway. He paced up and down the road a moment or two, and then sat down as he said, "I don't half understand what you've been talking about, and I fear you don't. You've evidently been listening and watching, and have got hold of something. Now I'll be as patient as I can if you'll tell me the whole story quickly." And he turned his flushed, quivering face toward her. "Then I suppose you'll scold me for listening and watching that scamp," said the girl sullenly. "No, Jane, not in this case. Unless your impressions are all mistaken, I may have you to thank all my life. I'm not one to forget those who are true to me. Now begin at the beginning and go right through to the end. Then I may understand better than you can." Jane did as she was told, and many "says he's" and "says she's" followed in her literal narrative. Holcroft again dropped his face into his hands, and before she was through, tears of joy trickled through his fingers. When she finished, he arose, turned away, and hastily wiped his eyes, then gave the girl his hand as he said, "Thank you, Jane. You've tried to be a true friend to me today. I'll show you that I don't forget. I was a fool to get in such a rage, but you can't understand and must forgive me. Come, so you see how quiet I am?" And he untied the horses and lifted her into his wagon. "What you going to do?" she asked as they drove away. "I'm going to reward you for watching and listening to that scoundrel, but you must not watch me or Mrs. Holcroft, or listen to what we say unless we speak before you. If you do, I'll be very angry. Now you've only one thing more to do, and that is show me where this man is hiding." "But you won't go near him alone?" inquired Jane in much alarm. "You must do as I bid you," he replied sternly. "Show me where he's hiding, then stay by the wagon and horses." "But he the same as said he'd kill you." "You have your orders," was his quiet reply. She looked scared enough, but remained silent until they reached a shaded spot in the road, and said, If you don't want him to see you too soon, better tie here. He's around yonder in a grove up on the hill." Holcroft drove to a tree by the side of the highway, and again tied his horses, then took the whip from the wagon. "Are you afraid to go with me a little way and show me where he is?" he asked. "No, but you oughtn't to go." "Come on, then. You must mind me if you wish to keep my good will. I know what I'm about." As in his former encounter, his weapon was again a long, tough whipstick, with a leather thong attached. This he cut off and put in his pocket. Then he followed Jane's rapid lead up the hill. Very soon she said, "There's the place I saw him in. If you will go, I'd steal up on him." "Yes, you stay here." She made no reply, but the moment he disappeared was upon his trail. Her curiosity was much greater than her timidity, and she justly reasoned that she had little to fear. Holcroft approached from a point whence Fergusson was expecting no danger. The latter was lying on the ground, gnawing his nails in vexation, when he first heard the farmer's step. Then he saw a dark-visaged man rushing upon him. In the impulse of his terror he drew his revolver and fired. The ball hissed near, but did no harm, and before Fergusson could use the weapon again, a blow from the whipstock paralyzed his arm, and the pistol dropped to the ground. So also did its owner a moment later, after a vindictive rain of blows, until he shrieked for mercy. "Don't move," said Holcroft sternly as he picked up the revolver. "So you meant to kill me, eh?" No, I didn't. I wouldn't have fixed it if he had fired if I hadn't been in self-defense, and because I hadn't had time to think." And he spoke with much difficulty, for his mouth was bleeding and he was terribly bruised. "A liar, too," said the farmer, glowering upon him. "But I knew that before. What did you mean by your threats to my wife?" "See here, Mr. Holcroft, I'm down at your mercy. If you'll let me off, I'll go away and never trouble you or your wife again." "Oh, no," said Holcroft with a bitter laugh. "You'll never trouble us again." "What, do you mean to murder me?" Fergusson half shrieked. "Would killing such a thing as you be murder? Any jury in the land would acquit me. You ought to be roasted over a slow fire." The fellow tried to scramble on his knees, but Holcroft hit him another savage blow and said, "Lie still." Fergusson began to wring his hands and beg for mercy. His captor stood over him a moment or two, irresolutely, in his white-heated anger. Then thoughts of his wife began to soften him. He could not go to her with blood on his hands, she who had taught him such lessons of forbearance and forgiveness. He put the pistol in his pocket, and, giving his enemy a kick, said, "Get up." The man rose with difficulty. "I won't waste time in asking any promises from you, but if you ever trouble my wife or me again, I'll break every bone in your body. Go, quick, before my mood changes, and don't say a word." As the man tremblingly untied his horses, Jane stepped out before him and said, "I'm a little idiotic girl, am I?" He was too thoroughly cowed to make any reply, and drove as rapidly away as the ground permitted, guiding his horse with difficulty in his maimed condition. Jane, in the exuberance of her pleasure, began something like a jig on the scene of conflict, and her antics were so ridiculous that Holcroft had to turn away to express a smile. "You didn't mind me, Jane," he said gravely. "Well, sir," she replied, "after showing you the way to him, you oughter not grudge me for seeing the fun. But it isn't nice for little girls to see such things." "Never saw anything nicer in my life. You're the kind of man I believe in, you are. Golly, I only wish she'd sing you. I've seen many a rough and tumble among farm hands, but never anything like this. It was only his pistol I was afraid of." "Will you do exactly what I say now?" She nodded. "Well, go home across the fields, and don't by word or manner let Mrs. Holcroft know what you've seen or heard, and say nothing about meeting me. Just make her think you know nothing at all, and that you only watched the man out of sight. Do this, and I'll give you a new dress." "I'd like something better sides that." "Well, what?" "I'd like to be sure I could stay right on with you." "Yes, Jane, after today, as long as you're a good girl. Now go, for I must get back to my team before this scamp goes by." She darted homeward as the farmer returned to his wagon. Fergusson soon appeared and seemed much startled as he saw his nemesis again. "I'll keep my word," he said as he drove by. "You'd better," called the farmer. "You know what to expect now." Alida was so prostrated by the shock of the interview that she rallied slowly. At last she saw that it was getting late and that she soon might expect the return of her husband. She dragged herself to the door and again called Jane, but the place was evidently deserted. Everything was coming on tranquilly, with all its sweet June sounds, but now every bird song was like a knell. She sunk on the porch seat and looked at the landscape, already so dear and familiar, as if she were taking a final farewell of a friend. Then she turned to the homely kitchen to which she had first been brought. "I can do a little more for him," she thought, "before I make the last sacrifice which will soon bring the end. I think I could have lived perhaps till I was old if I had gone among strangers from the almshouse. But I can't now. My heart is broken. Now that I've seen that man again, I understand why my husband cannot love me. Even the thought of touching me must make him shudder. But I can't bear up under such a load much longer, and that's my comfort. It's best I should go away now. I couldn't otherwise." And the tragedy went on in her soul as she feebly prepared her husband's meal. At last Jane came in with her basket of peas. Her face was so impassive as to suggest that she had no knowledge of anything except that there had been a visitor, and Alida had sunk into such depths of despairing sorrow that she scarcely noticed the child.